his unexplainable feats to sorcery. Yet even this confirms the gospel accounts. Because in the Gospels, Jesus' miracles were often attributed to the power of Satan or sorcery, he was accused of performing miracles by the power of Beelzebub, the ruler of the devils. The Talmud also describes Jesus as an influential teacher, and many of the rabbinical leaders of his day were undecided whether this man was merely a heretic or deceiver or perhaps the Messiah. Now, this is written by Jesus' enemies. I want to just give you one quote from the Bible, and it really is a succinct explanation of why Jesus performed miraculous signs. Acts chapter 2 and verse 22. Ye men of Israel. Now, let me give you sort of the context of this speech. It's Peter speaking. It's the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost was 50 days after Passover. It was the feast of the first fruits. Passover was the first Jewish celebration. It was the same as our Easter. The Passover lamb was slain. 50 days after that, it was a feast of the ingathering of the first fruits. This is all symbolic for Christianity later. These feasts are all portraying Jesus. The Passover lamb was slain. 50 days after the Passover, the first fruits then, the promise of what was going to be gathered later. The Holy Spirit descended on Christianity 50 days after the Passover, showing that we have got the down payment of the Holy Spirit in our hearts as a promise that the rest of the harvest is going to come in when we see Jesus. This is all highly symbolic. And so the Passover was celebrated. The Feast of Pentecost was at hand. The Holy Spirit comes on the church, and these men are filled with the Spirit of God, and they begin to speak in languages that they've never known before. And they're talking about Jesus. And people are going, what is going on here? And we've got a list in the book of Acts, all these different places where they were coming from. And so there's this crowd's coming together and say, what is this miracle all about? And so Peter stands up. And he's preaching this message, and this is how he starts his message. You men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved by God by miracles. So that's the first reason we see here why Jesus performed miracles. It was to verify, to attest, and to validify every claim that Jesus made. Jesus of Nazareth was attested by God among us by miracles, wonders, and signs, which he did in our midst, as you yourselves also know. He's appealing to their first-hand recollection of what Jesus did. And may I remind you that the book of Acts was written no later than 60 A.D., and so when this was written, it could have been refuted or verified, and it would have never been included in the book of Acts unless it was historical truth. This is who Jesus is. So now we're at this feast of Canaan, and he's commencing his miracles. He's going to start his earthly ministry, and Jesus' mother is there. I want you just to think with me today what it would have been like to have been the mother of Christ. First of all, you know that this child was born supernaturally, that you conceived this child while you were betrothed to Joseph, that there is something so incredibly miraculous about your child that angels announced its birth. The angels came and told her that this child of yours is going to be called Yeshua, which means he will save his people from his sins. And not only that, he is going to sit on the throne of David forever. So she knows all this theology. I want to remind you, when Jesus was 8 days old, they brought him into the temple. And Simeon, the prophet, when that little infant child came through the back door of that temple, Simeon runs and he picks up the child and he says, now let your servant die in peace, for I have seen the salvation of the Lord. And Mary is wondering, what is going on with this child? the age of 12, they leave Jesus at the temple. They forget about him. They're going back. They came up for a feast. 3 days later, they start looking among all the relatives. Well, where is he? They run back to Jerusalem. They find him in the temple. And Mary and Joseph come in and says, "What are you doing, you little rascal? Don't you know we've been looking for you? You've been worried sick. Where have you been?" And all the scribes, the teachers of the law, are sitting at Jesus' feet, and he's answering their questions, and he's asking them questions that they can't answer. And Jesus turns around and he says, "Mom, didn't you know that I must be about my Father's business?" And Mary ponders all those things in her heart. And now Jesus is going to start his ministry, and there's not any wine. And she says, "Oh, Jesus, I've been waiting for 30 years for you to do something. You've been a carpenter your whole life. Now I want you to show everybody what you're all about." And Jesus very gently says, "Woman," he doesn't call her mom, "there's a new era beginning. Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? I am living on a spiritual agenda, and nothing's going to get me off of that. It's not time for me to show all of my glory. It's not time for Israel to come in as a nation. It's not time to overthrow the Roman Empire. There's a cross that Jesus must bear." And he says, "My hour is not yet come." I'd like to challenge you today to take a concordance and look at that word, hour, in John's Gospel and see how many times it's used. I don't have time to look at all the references today, but in John chapter 12 and verse 23, Greeks, Gentiles are coming up to the feast of Passover. This is right before Jesus' crucifixion. The Jewish nation has rejected Christ. Gentiles, Greeks, are seeking to know Jesus. They said, "We would see Jesus." But Jesus' answer is, "Now is my hour. It's come. It's here." The Jewish people have rejected him. The Messiah is here. I am going to the cross. So this story starts out by Jesus saying, "You know what? My agenda is a spiritual agenda. I'm here to do certain things that you must understand what it's all about, and I want to picture something for you at this wedding feast that I want you to get so clearly." The Jews were so accustomed to doing all their religious duties, and they had 6 pots that would hold 20 gallons of water apiece. John tells us that these water pots were for purification purposes. The Jews, anytime they had a feast, anytime they had a wedding, before you ate, everybody there had to wash their hands properly. That's why they had 6 water pots. These things were massive. They held 20 gallons. This was a big feast. Not only did the hands have to be washed, but all the cups, all the plates, everything had to have this ceremonial cleansing, this washing. Jesus tells them to fill these water pots up to the brim. The Jewish ceremonial cleansing. Then he says, "Go and draw water now." Now, where did they draw water from to fill up those pots? They drew it from the well, right? So when he tells them to draw out now, I believe that he's telling them to go back to the well and draw out water. Not the pots. No one in Jewish culture would ever think of drinking water out of a water pot. This is for ceremonial cleansing. It's for washing hands. It's for washing cups. It's for washing pots. He says, you go back and you draw out now. You go back to that well because I'm going to start my miracles by a new commencement. It's going to be so radical, and I want you to get this, my disciples. The Jewish system of washing, the Jewish system of purification, you can have 180 gallons of water, but it's not going to supply anything. I am going to take that well that has a continual spring in it, that has a continual flow, and I am going to supply wine, the new wine of the new covenant. I'm going to commence something new, and it's got nothing to do with Judaism. It's got nothing to do with rituals. It's got nothing to do with ceremonies. It is powerful. It is living, and it is miraculous. And so Jesus says, you go to that well, and you draw out now. And not only was it a miracle, but it was a miracle of excellence. When Jesus did it, it was new wine that he made. It was the best wine. Instead of bringing out the old wine at the last of the feast, Jesus brings out the fresh wine. He brings out the good wine. I want you to turn, if you've got a Bible, quickly to Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 5, and this will be our conclusion for today. Luke 5, 37 through 39. Now Jesus spoke a parable to them. No one puts a piece of a new garment on an old one. Otherwise, the new makes the tear, and the piece that was taken out of it, and the new does not match the old. I'm not reading that correctly. Let me start over. Then he spoke a parable to them. No one puts a piece from a new garment on an old one. Otherwise, the new makes a tear, and the old piece that was taken out from the new, does not match the old. No one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskin and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. You can't try to reform an old habit. You can't just try to patch up a battered life. You can't take new wine and try to just pour it in an old wine skin. You know, this is the way man tries to fix everything. Well, I'll just try a little bit better. I'll just make turn over a new leaf, or I'll redo it, and I'll try harder next time. And Jesus is saying it doesn't work that way. You come to me, and you need a new heart. You need a new start. And that's what Jesus is all about. He is all about new beginnings in our life. I like what Luke adds here in this verse. He says in verse 39, and no one having drunk old wine immediately desires the new. For the old, he says, is better. You know what? I don't want to try. This is working fine. Just leave me alone. You know, I don't need a new start. But what did Jesus do in this miracle? They had drank the old wine. And no one's going to desire it. No one's going to say, well, I want this new wine. I want to try something new. I want this new, fresh start. So Jesus takes this wine and he takes it to the guest, the chairman of the committee or whatever, and he tastes that wine, not knowing what Jesus had done. He says, you have brought out the best wine now. I've tasted the new wine, and it is significantly better. I want you to understand what Jesus is doing in this commencement of his miracles. Jesus